So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this project with you, or to give you a sense of how this comes about, both in terms of the convention, if you wish, if you're interested in refugee issues, or in terms of undocumented, because I think that both of them lead to, at least for me, the same conclusions. Are there any comments or questions that you want to? Yeah?
Yeah, just anecdotally, you suggested that you could share some of the anecdotes.
Please.
Yes?
Yes. Oh, you want me to share the anecdotes? I was hoping you were going to share anecdotes.
No, but I would just begin to put some faces on it.
Okay, I'll show you. I'm going to share with you one of the most terrifying anecdotes I can possibly share, and it has so many different layers to it that I think in one anecdote it will offer you a lot of different information. Okay, I'm Canadian. I was hired at Vanderbilt University. I had been a visiting professor at Yale, and I was hired at Vanderbilt, and I came on a visa as a professor, and I was waiting for the green card, which took, as it turns out, about 3 years. When I arrived, they had regular driver's licenses for people on visas and for undocumented people. Shortly thereafter, they changed the law, and they're really not aiming at people like myself, they're aiming at undocumented people, so that you only got a driver's permit and not a driver's license. There's this distinction that you could use it to drive, but you couldn't use it for identification. So that was the sudden situation that I was in, whatever. I was working with the Tennessee Department of Corrections on this project. My project was very much directed towards understanding the plight of those people who were suffering the most, I say people who had been incarcerated. So the Tennessee Department of Corrections, which had been incredibly forthright and incredibly helpful in this project, had told me that I could interview people who were in violation of immigration laws, and that's why they were being held in prisons in Tennessee. So I got on my motorcycle, and I drove from Vanderbilt University to the maximum security prison, which is only a few miles away. It's another living, learning community, but it's quite different from Vanderbilt. I arrived at the front, and the rule in prison, I don't know if you've ever visited a prison or a maximum security, but you're only allowed to have 2 things with you, which is a key and a license. So those are the only 2 things that I brought with me, a key and a license. I had nothing else at all. I went inside, and I went up to the area where they screen you, and the guy says, do you have your license? He looks at it, my license says, not valid for identification purposes. And he says, I'm sorry, I cannot allow you in. I cannot allow you access to the prison. And I said, your warden actually has given me permission to be here today in order to interview some undocumented people. And he said, I'm sorry, it says right here, not valid for identification. And I said, is it possible to perhaps call him or something so that I can gain access? And he goes and makes a few calls and so forth. And eventually, they allowed me access into the prison, where I met with a couple of undocumented people, or people who had been in the prison for immigration-related violations. One of the guys I met was born on a refugee camp in Thailand and had been selected for immigration purposes by American authorities to come to the U.S. as a refugee, as a landed refugee. So he had been raised in, I believe it was Clarksville, Tennessee, but his family was Cambodian. He had never been to Cambodia, but his family was Cambodian. As a high school student, he had gotten into an altercation, and he had punched a guy. And the police arrested him, and I think that sometimes, in certain cases, when you're trying to give a strong message to somebody, you find ways of throwing the book at that person, and in certain cases we do this to young people. In that case, because his immigration situation was still slightly in flux, they set him up for deportation, which really made no sense legally, but he was set up for deportation. He got into trouble. I don't know exactly how long time he was in custody or whatever it was. But years later, he was in his early 20s, he got into another fight at a Walmart in the parking lot, and he punched somebody again and was arrested. The officer brought him in. They looked him up on ICE. This is often the key word. So they looked him up, and they found that not only was his immigration situation not entirely fixed. But on top of that, he had been set up previously for deportation, and that's a really, really nefarious offense. That's a felony in this country. So I met with him. He had an incredibly strong Tennessee accent. He was the sweetest, kindest person you could possibly imagine. And his story was the story of a kid who got into a couple of fights, which happens when you're young and vivacious, as he was. But in his particular situation, because he had been set up for deportation, and because he was now in violation a second time, they were holding him pending a method to send him back to Cambodia. He had never been to Cambodia. His family was Cambodian, but he had not been there certainly in any recognizable way. We don't have a deportation agreement with Cambodia, apparently. And therefore, from what they told me, there was no way to get him out of prison. And so we always use these terms like catch-22 and so forth. In one of these impossible situations where it was just, everybody in the prison loved him, he was perfectly, but there was just no way to get him out of there. And he had been there for a few years already. He had just been, when I interviewed him, he had just been in lockdown for a violation. And he had called by accident a cell phone from the prison, which is illegal, so he'd been in lockdown. So it was just the most horrendous situation. Anyhow, I can't tell you how all of these things made me feel, except to say that, you spend most of your time doing research like this on the verge of tears. It's so dreadful. And the more you find out, the more horrendous these things tend to be. So I left the prison, and I got onto the motorcycle, and I started driving. And first of all, I got lost because I was just so, I'm disoriented to begin with, but I was so frightened and horrified by this unbelievably terrible situation. And I finally made it back to Vanderbilt, and there's a bar that I go to regularly. It's a pizza place that I go to regularly for beers. So I went to the pizza place for a beer because, what do you do? What do you do for this kid? So I sit down in the bar, and the guy says, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, "Pretty badly. I just need a drink." He goes, "Can I see your ID?" So I said, "Thank you." Honestly, I really appreciate that I look under 21 is a kind judge. I have a child who's 22, so I really appreciate you thinking I'm under 21. Thank you. So I pulled out my driver's permit, and he looked at me and goes, "I'm sorry, I can't serve you a beer. This says it's not valid for identification purposes." So I thought, this is deja vu. I've been through this today already. And then I remembered that in the bottom of my motorcycle bag, I had kept an old driver's license from the period when I was allowed to have a real driver's license before they changed the law. And I said, "You know what?" I said to this 23-year-old person, "Hold on 2 seconds. I'm just going to go and get something in my bag." I go and get my old expired driver's license in this case, which is valid for identification. He looks at it and goes, "I'm sorry, I can't serve you. This is expired." That's the kind of, and I think that so many of the stories involved in people who are in these horrendous situations is captured in an anecdote like that. From the fact that the people in the prison loved this person but couldn't find a way out. The judge's hands are tied in these cases because there's mandatory deportation, there's mandatory sentencing, there's mandatory ways in which we handle these. There's not even the kind of leniency that you sometimes get in these cases. And in the complete craziness of a situation like that, where here we are together and you hear that story and think, well, that's just preposterous, it's outrageous, we should do something. Had I not accidentally been in that prison that day, nobody would have ever even heard about this guy. And that's another part of this that comes up so often. It's heartbreaking. As I said, I'm sorry on a beautiful day to be such a downer, but it is really, really heartbreaking.
And is he still there?
As far as I know. There's just, there are stories, and when you talk to public, the most, and I don't need to tell you because this is, you're part of a caring community. It's the people on the front lines who know the most. It's the translators, it's the public defenders, it's the nurses, it's the border guards, it's the people in the prisons. They know what's going on. The academics turn this into some unbelievably complicated language that in many cases, that doesn't necessarily serve the needs of these people. But for the most part, we don't understand what's going on in the system. We read these horrendous statistics. 2.5 million people in America are in jail, or 15 million people are undocumented. But unless you are on the sort of front lines of dealing with what their experience is every day, it's very hard for us to understand just how terrible it is. And speaking with people who are working with them, like public defenders, is a really mind-boggling experience. But these people cry. These people sit around and cry. And one of the public defenders told me that on a number of occasions there was a judge who's making decisions crying because there are these when I say mandatory sentences, I'm saying returning after a deportation is a felony, and you can go to federal prison for up to 6 years. If you have a previous charge, a previous felony, DUI, drug charge, something like that, it can easily go up to 10. And in a lot of these cases, again, sad anecdotes, a lot of people return to this country because they're visiting children, their own children. So family values, fighting family values, it's a big platform, and we recall that from the 80s with Reagan's, anyway, no words, but if we're really supporting family values, we shouldn't randomly be throwing people in jail for a long time, or even for a short time. It makes no sense. Are there other, yes?
I'm wondering about the trend for American workers with Walmart and these other companies where the wages continually go down and they can't make a living wage, both working in a family and still not making it. Isn't this something that business, having no borders, would love as a way to create a big pool of folks to push the immiseration even farther?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be sensible to have a working visa system where folks for particular types of jobs like agriculture and others that are so desperately needed come in and are legally protected and have the right to change employers instead of like the old Bracero system, so that they can come in and actually work and be protected and even have certain rights such as health care and other things through that type of visa system. How do you think about that?
That's a great question. In many ways, what you're describing would turn out to be very similar. But in many ways, what you're describing faces the same difficulties as what I'm describing. What you're talking about is benign, careful, thoughtful oversight of a program designated for workers. What I'm talking about is very, very similar, virtually identical, because what I also think is implicit in this is us emulating the EU system, whereby you say we're not going to go towards the lowest common denominator of hiring and environmental practices. We're going to, in fact, raise up the standards. So I wouldn't think that one should open up the borders without careful regulation of what that means. And the EU has done this. Lots of problems and so forth, but they have done this so that the standards that, say, a Mexican national would have in an American corporation, or the standards that an American would have in a Mexican corporation, would be regulated very strongly. I think that's a really important point. In the same way that, one of the arguments you could make also against both of us is that, okay, fine, you're really only favoring workers and workers with jobs, which are already set up, and you're still not allowing for the real free movement. And the EU has a system whereby you can freely move to another EU country and say look for work for a period of time, and if you don't find it within a few months, then you have to go back to your country. So one could imagine again a variation on your description, because the problem is that you probably have to procure that visa in the country of origin, which, as you know, would keep certain types of people out. You could have a system whereby you say, okay, we have free movement, but if you're going to work in the country, you need to find a job within 6 months. And that would at least allow, because a lot of the bureaucratic stuff that gets in the way of people being okay in systems like this is daunting. So visa requirements, filling out these forms, making sure that the forms are accurate, getting the right x-rays and medical, for those of you who have kids in college, you know very well that one of the great barriers to college education is FAFSA and the application process itself. I mean, you've got to be really, really literate in the ways of bureaucracy to even do these things. I find it to be a relatively full-time job since Marcia and I have 3 kids, just to do this every year. Imagine the person you're describing, let's say a worker in Guatemala who's going to be hired by a corporation here and has to fill out certain kinds of forms and so forth, has to make sure that they're correct. That becomes an impediment and a barrier, and potentially, because when you're in this situation of discomfort, one of the things that you do is you say what you think the authorities want to hear. It means that people fill out forms like that inappropriately, in the same way that they say the wrong things to police officers because they're just trying to get out of the situation. So I think that what you're describing is great, but you'd have to really try and set it up in a way that would be open, truly open, and not yet another form of restriction. Yes.
So it almost seems like what you're proposing would be almost in contest with, free trade agreements like NAFTA. How would you reconcile a more open border system as far as what you're speaking about in comparison to something like that?
Well, free trade. Sometimes you have to sleep with the enemy in activism, as you know. I remember the case of Pinochet. And the people who are saying the most sane things about the Pinochet situation were the people in the House of Lords. And you're like, God, I don't normally support people in the House of Lords, but in this particular case, I'm going to go for it. I think that we can use the general agreement that people have that free trade is a good thing, and the presence of something like NAFTA as already existing to argue this point. So let's take NAFTA, for example. NAFTA is supposed to be a free trade. It even has it in the title. But free trade historically has included the free movement of laborers across the borders. NAFTA excludes the free trade of labor across borders. So as you know, for example, Chomsky talks about how many times, say, a fender might cross the border between Mexico and the US as they're building a car. And I heard a number that was something like 20. That sounds probably like an exaggeration, but pieces of cars and so forth freely cross the border with complete impunity. The people who are building those cars don't, except for, of course, the executives. So I think that NAFTA perhaps provides a framework, at least to talk to people and say, you think we have free trade, but we actually don't. So if you would like to have free trade, and if you support NAFTA, and if you think that NAFTA is a good idea, then let's go for it. Let's go for NAFTA to begin, which means free borders between Mexico, the US, and Canada, and let's expand NAFTA into Latin America, into Central and South America, which also that this has been an argument. So I think we'd have to, as people who are fighting the good fight, you sometimes have to harness something which is otherwise quite nefarious, because it doesn't include a lot of the positive sides of the EU. It doesn't have strong pollution regulations. It doesn't have strong safety protection for workers and so forth. It's just much more of a kind of free-for-all. It's been very negative for every... It's one of these wonderful agreements where all 3 parties to the agreement has suffered on its account. It's a disaster from every possible way, which is insane. It shouldn't be like that. So I think for publicity purposes, for discussion purposes, it's one of, again, I keep invoking Noam because I feel like I should. He talks about the difference between what people are thought to believe and what they actually believe. Here's another example where people are thought to believe, they think that NAFTA is a free trade and it's not. So let's go for it. Let's say, okay, fine, you want free trade, let's go for it. Let's actually talk about that. Are there other questions or yes, President?
In talking about your presentation with a friend of mine at work, I came to learn that her sister works for ICE, and they recently deported a woman because she had been abused by her partner, and she hit back, and when they looked her up, they found she didn't have papers, and she was deported to Mexico for defending herself. I checked out an earlier book Chomsky did, because I knew what your topic was going to be. It's called A agribusiness was going to flood Mexico and dislocate farmers in Mexico.
Mhm.
So they knew that there was going to be these economic refugees from kind of a hurricane NAFTA.
Mhm.
And they instituted Operation Gatekeeper, which has fed into this detention industrial complex. And I know Boeing has been involved in putting along the high-tech sensors. So again, becomes there's that underlying corporatist racket going on around these systems of so-called security that we're developing. I monitor a fair amount of right-wing talk radio and the anti-immigrant English-only narratives are very distressing. So I appreciate you bringing this more humane perspective and introducing the concept of open borders
Mhm.
and how useful that could be for workers and also for people who just want to exchange and learn cultures. But again, I do appreciate Chris's point about how possibly that could bring wages down. But the flip side, and the flip side to the bad news is the organizing going on across borders. I know a lot of automaker unions have been going from the U.S. to Colombia to other places. So instead of everyone being brought down, organized labor can bring everyone's condition up.
Totally.
And really kind of live the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN talks about. So where do you see the positive? Where do you see the solidarity going on, the networking, the cooperation? Could you share those stories?
Stories from places like this are tremendously uplifting. The work of, I think the work of public defenders in particular has been incredibly powerful. The problem in the case, I think the problem in the case of the relationship between activists and what's going on in the undocumented realm sometimes can be related to language. I think that if we were to be more familiar with what was going on and what is going on in those communities, it would be we would have stronger activism. The problem is that you need to speak not just Spanish but good Spanish. So that's, on the other hand, it has been the case that interpreters and translators have taken a certain lead in some of these discussions, and I find that to be absolutely fascinating. Some of the most interesting detail of what's happening in some of the kind of outreach that's been going on has been undertaken by translators or investigators who work for public defenders to try to understand what's going on in the community. And some of the uplifting stories involve, for example, people coming into places like this. So you'll have a translator or an investigator coming into a place like this, in which there is a sympathetic community, but also perhaps a lot of undocumented people who come to Mass and say, here's the situation. You shouldn't drive your car on the highways because highways they're traps set out specifically for you. Don't shoot off your gun at parties. I know that you did it back home, but don't do it here. Don't. And those are very, very helpful because honestly, in this case, the way to save people, at least in the current situation, is to keep them out of harm's way, and harm's way is in the way of officials. I guess the other uplifting side is just daily, the ways in which police officers and border guards and so forth don't always do the wrong thing. In fact, in most cases, I think they probably do the right thing, which is people just go along on their way. That's I'm searching here because it ain't easy, but those are. But you raise a couple of other points that I think are important. One of them is that, and again, I'm trying to think of how we can create a legitimate system. One of the so-called legitimate systems that's been proposed is that if you remain with the same employer for say 3 to 5 years as an undocumented person, that this would allow you the possibility of applying for a green card. That sounds okay. It's a type of thing, and again, let me give you another example. I'm from Quebec. I have never seen currency in a hospital. There's no currency in hospitals. There are no bills. I'm being slightly facetious here, but not really. Everybody has a card, and you go to the hospital, and you get treated, and you go home. And you never hear from them again. I'm always struck. I have this platinum elite faculty thing, and you go there, and you have an infected toe, and they treat it, and then you get a $312 bill in the mail. And I have one of these things that people brag about, and it's still $312. I don't understand. Like, it's very, very strange. So I think we have to be careful in thinking about what some of these proposals actually mean as opposed to how they sound. So I get back to this example. So okay, so you work for the same employer for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, whatever it is, and then you're eligible for a green card. Okay, that sounds fine. Now let's go to the front lines. You have a painter who owns a company, and he hires 6 undocumented workers. He pays them $7 an hour to paint houses. This is everywhere, as you know, in America. It's very, very common. Another painter sees the work of one of the undocumented people and says, "You are a really, really good worker. I mean, spectacular. And my American workers were paid $25 to do what you do. I'll give you 20." So you go back to your employer and you say, "I think I'm going to leave this employment because I'm going to make 20 instead of 7, and the employer calls ICE. And that happens all the time. I can give you more nefarious examples that we don't need tremendous imaginations, but imagine housekeepers and domestic workers who have been in a place for a while, and some person wants to get something more than a clean home out of the arrangement. If you're stuck with the same employer for 3 to 5 years, the possibility that there will be abuse is unimaginably high, even no matter what the field. So that's why, honestly, but at the end of the day, I've come, and again, I'm sort of answering your question, I've come to be in favor not just of cheaper tuitions, but of no tuitions. Not just subsidized healthcare, but no charge for healthcare. Not $1, because $1 is way too much. Way too much, because it's a slippery slope. In Quebec, I don't know if you hear about these things, in Quebec, they brought the government down, the Liberal government down. They wanted to have a $300, I think it was, tuition increase from, would have brought tuition at McGill and UQAM and Université de Montréal and Cordy up to $1,900 a year, and they said $300, no, not a chance. And Americans are going, $300? Are you kidding? I pay that in sculpting fees for my kid in art class, in addition to $60,000. I paid $300 to have him go to the masquerade ball on Friday, the 12th of April. Are you kidding? $300? But no, the Quebec guys were right. What they did wrong, I think, was they should have said, okay, no more tuition. It's just ridiculous. I paid, when I was in Quebec, $800 a year. It was $800 too much. Because it's the wrong, and every argument that you give, it always sounds fine. Once again, you get onto the front lines, it doesn't work. Our countries are wealthy enough to support free healthcare. They're wealthy enough to support free tuition, and there should be open borders, open without any strings. You put a string, and we're going to have another disaster.
Talking about right-wing radio, I had a heated discussion with my neighbor last night who's already upset enough about welfare mothers. So how would you argue with him? I'm imagining trying to convince him that you wouldn't have the influx of people who want free education and want free health care and want maybe not to work and have a safety net.
All of this is premised upon a fallacious first assumption. In a previous book that I wrote called Arguing and Justifying, I was interested in a very simple question, which is, if you're in a bad relationship, in this case a bad relationship with the state, at what point do you stand up and say, I'm leaving you? I honestly didn't realize when I was writing this book that that's what it was about. I thought it was about immigration, but I realize now that Arguing and Justifying was about bad relationships. At what point do you say, you know what, I've put up with you for a long time, I ain't happy, goodbye. But in this case, it was about convention refugees. So if you've been repeatedly jailed, if you've been tortured, if you've been raped, if you've been not allowed to work, whatever it is, if all those things have happened to you, at what point do you wake up in the morning and say, I'm leaving this country, I'm leaving my language, my friends, my family, my work, everything, I'm leaving and I'm going to go to America. Our perception of that is that they're coming here to pick the gold off the trees. The reality is that is complete nonsense. And people leave with a tremendous amount of resistance in the first instance. People stay through tremendous hardship because people develop community. You leave your community, it's really tough. And then what, you're going to go to Quebec? Okay, you get free healthcare, that's cool. It's like 46 below in June. Your heating is so expensive. And you get this gigantic handout from the government. Huge, you get like $1,200 a month. This handout. It's nonsense. What kind of a life is that? People who leave their countries, people who get up and uproot their lives, do so under tremendous duress. And most people, if you open up borders, don't go. We know from the Berlin Wall that there was relatively free movement between East and West until they put up the wall. You put up a wall and all of a sudden people want to leave. That's the other point about open borders. Very interesting. But I think the thing that I learned most about arguing and justifying is that people who are going to want to leave are probably going to leave anyway and create tremendous hardship. But most people will not. They will not. People are attached to their communities. And by the way, Puebla is a really beautiful place. And Cancun's a really cool place to live. And Mexico City is a really awesome city. Like this idea that Cincinnati is like the place that everybody in the third world wants to live is complete nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Not true. So I think that one of the arguments that one has to make about this is to say that this so-called flood that's going to happen is a fictitious self-serving lie. And furthermore, it denies the other thing that I mentioned, but it's worth saying. For those of us with kids, I'd love to be able to send my kids to Mexico City to go and get a job for a while. I'd love, and as a kid, I would have loved to have gone surfing and swimming in the seaside towns of Mexico and be able to work a little bit on the side legally. That would have been really cool. So I think these are some of the arguments that have to be made. And it's usually, and again, I want to pay my debt to Noam here. It takes going down deeper. The rhetoric in this country on the so-called left and on the so-called right usually avoids the actual question. Well, how long should we incarcerate these people for? As soon as you ask that question, you've lost it. How much should we be paying for health care? Okay, we've lost that one too. We can't think like that. You need to not incarcerate people for immigration violations. It's insane. You need to not incarcerate people for drug infractions. It's crazy. We need to not incarcerate people for minor infractions of our endless collection of laws that tends to work against certain types of people and not others. It's crazy. And by the way, this is the other thing to argue, I think, is free movement of people. I got that. I got a visa and a passport, and I'm a professor at Vanderbilt. I have money in the bank. I got pretty. Sometimes I have to line up to get a visa to go to certain countries, but basically I live in a country of free movement of people. So why just me? It doesn't seem to sound very fair. That I think is another argument to make. Yeah.
Now it's anecdotal. It's so interesting to me. I'm sort of thinking about the difference between thinking about the EU and open borders, and I think I've just been, because of the rhetoric, open borders sounds scarier than the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you're right. I mean, I can move freely there, but I can't work freely there. And yet, the idea that folks in the EU, because I spend some time there, can, right? And they can move across those borders. The idea that you can say, yeah, you've got 6 months or a year or whatever. I think it's scary. Italy, I notice, having a tough time having open borders from the seas, but still doing it, still figuring it out, and there are people there that are figuring out how to welcome refugees without being colorblind. And so it's interesting to me that I would go open borders. Oh, so there's still, because I think it's the rhetoric. I think
You're totally right. And the other rhetoric that we get is EU. Why? What's our problem with the EU? Well, apparently, bad Portugal and bad Greece, bad Ireland. They haven't paid their debts to the banks. Well, last time I checked, that's a nonsense. So people say, EU is a complete failure. Really, you go to Portugal, it doesn't look like a complete failure to me. There's high unemployment in Greece, and there's high unemployment in Portugal. But what? We're supposed to demonize those places because they didn't pay back the banks? No, the banks made a loan, an outrageous loan in most cases, to build a lot of stuff that was either suggested to them by the IMF or the brilliant idea of some insane politician, and now the people don't want to be on the hook for it. Well, that's called risk. Banks are supposed to be in the business of risk, and we're supposed to demonize them because they don't pay their debts. Forget it. That's it. So I think there too, the stories that are told are so outrageous, and we come to formulate very strong opinions about these things. Now, this is a risky talk. I can give it to you. It is a risky talk. Why? Because the moment I name EU, everybody's like, yeah, what about Greece? What about Cyprus? Are you kidding me? Well, let's talk about that for a second. But you're right. And open borders, wow, that's really logical. That's a really good idea. But we're so conditioned. We're really free healthcare. You can barely even mention it. And yet, and this is, again, it's another big Chomsky question that I don't begin to understand. In Quebec, if you had to do anything other than bring this little orange card with you to get free healthcare, you'd go crazy. To imagine going to a doctor and having to pay something, you drive for an hour and a quarter and you're in Burlington, Vermont, which is a very liberal, very cool, very awesome little town. And for them, it's completely normal. In Quebec, to carry a handgun, I don't even know how extreme the fringe would have to be in Quebec to even mention this idea. To be arrested for carrying pot or hash or whatever, it's not even worth talking about. We can't even mention it. But somehow, an hour and a quarter away, in a very, very cool and liberal place, almost all the values are reversed. Well, that says something about propaganda. It's really very powerful. And again, I mentioned in here translation and language studies. You have to, and this is why I think Chomsky is so important, in one of the many reasons. You have to think about language. You always have to think about language. Power happens with language. Propaganda happens with language. Prejudices happen in language. Stereotypes happen in language. Open borders versus EU happens in language. And to try to figure out how that works has to be part of our process as people who care about changing the world.
I've actually had that exact argument with a right-wing radio host regarding, they would frame it as, they're going to come here and take our stuff. But again, reading the stuff of Chomsky's, you learn how long the U.S. empire and the Europeans have been taking stuff from the Southern Hemisphere.
Oh.
So to the extent that they are able to come here, I kind of see it as reparations for the colonialism, wars. And if we really wanted to make people at home where they're at, we'd have fair trade. And we'd stop training security forces that oppress labor organizers in these other countries. And so there's that different approach.
Oh, the double standards are spectacular. Yeah, absolutely. You go to an island in the Caribbean and you look at the way the people are working, and you look at the infrastructure that's been left behind by French and Spanish and English colonizers, and then you think that they sucked those places dry, they murdered indigenous peoples who were living there, and they left nothing. And that seems to be okay. That we have no problem with. That's fine. But the moment, as you say, something like reparations are put into. But again, I think that too is a somewhat slippery slope. I think it's dangerous politically to say, well, look, we've been robbing and pillaging and raping and murdering forever, so people should be able to come in here. That sounds like we're giving them something. Whereas if you just say, look, just open borders, just open it. You want to go anywhere, somewhere, go. They want to come work here? Fine, cool, great. I think you avoid a lot of the risks. Because the arguments that you have with the right-wing radio show people are going to be, that was in the past. I never did that. You say, we murdered all the Native American. Yeah, but that was a long time ago. You get destroyed in those arguments.
NAFTA is going on today, and the School of the Americas is still training. But I understand your point.
Yeah, it's risky. It's risky stuff.
They'll hate the open borders argument. I'll give it a shot.
Yes.
Well, given that you Canadians are so crazy, I'm just wondering, is there anybody in Washington who's thinking about this idea with the fractionalization that we're going through these days? Is there any hope in this idea?
Well, as I mentioned previously, sometimes you have to have really, really terrible bedfellows in political situations. We know this from House of Cards. Your bedfellows in this particular discussion, and I hate to say it, are the big corporations. They don't come out in favor of this. Even the Koch brothers or all that, they're not going to come out in favor publicly in most cases. But the honest truth is that the benefits that the companies who are trying to just ship things across borders would derive from having a mobile workforce and trucks that can easily pass. Your friends used to be my friends in this regard used to be the Wall Street Journal. It's now become insane. It's very hard to read. It was always insane. But Chomsky used to say that you could read the Wall Street Journal because it's less ideological than the New York Times. They need to make more money, and therefore they kind of tell the truth. Now the thing's just become incredibly ideological, so it's not that helpful anymore. But you can read the Financial Times and Financial Post for useful information. Your buddies in the discussion of open borders are certainly companies. But we get back to another crucial point, which is corporations, by their very nature, we don't need to demonize them. They are in the business of making profit. So you need to regulate the daylights out of them. If we're going to have something like this, you have to have heavy regulations and heavy protections for the vulnerable, that is to say the environment and the workers. And I'll give you another anecdote about this in this regard. I met with the person who, from my perspective, is a kind of Attila the Hun in this whole business, which is the guy who invented private prisons. I had him over at my house. Private prisons, as you can just imagine, is such a racket. And their lobbyists are so horrible. And what they want is so destructive. And he sat there and he said something which I think is... I think one of my great faults was I never used to talk to people in depth who didn't agree with me. You gotta talk to the people who really, really, really don't agree with you. And he sat there and he said, you know what, the real problem is not private prisons. Because honestly, it's the same thing. Because the problem is regulation. He said, let me give you an example. He said, private prisons are penalized. They lose profits if there's one thing that happens. That one thing is that somebody escapes from jail. That's the only way that they get fined. So what do if you're the president of a private prison company? You make sure that nobody ever escapes. How do you make sure nobody ever escapes? You lock them in their cell all the time. It's such a hassle when they leave their cell. Because they're like moving around, bathroom, or cafeteria, or library. That's just a big pain in the ass. You have training programs, and you get rid of all that stuff. So lockdowns are awesome. It's the greatest thing in the world. He's in his cell for 23 hours a day. Then he's way easier to control. So this guy said, if the state said instead, you get penalized if the guy goes back to jail. As soon as I say it, you're like, yeah, that's pretty logical. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Nobody does that. Why not? Recidivism is the biggest nightmare problem in the American justice system. If you forced private firms to train, help, treat, educate people when they're in their prison, and reward them when they learn other languages, when they learn skills that are marketable and so forth and so on, when they get over drug addiction and so forth, and you reward them then they would just do it. you know, we're saying Boulder. Boulder is gorgeous. It's beautiful, awesome. There's all sorts of regulations, I'm guessing, about signs and about, you know, where you can put stuff and whether or not you can recycle. I used to live in Switzerland. There's no, you're not allowed to put out signs. You're not allowed to put. You're going to tell me that Switzerland is not a successful country? It's outrageously successful. But you don't need to be successful by tearing up the environment. You don't need to be successful by not recycling. You don't need to be successful by putting up ugly, stupid buildings that are going to, you know, fall apart and fall into disarray. It's all about regulations. So you could do the same thing with prisons. You could do the same thing with anything, and it's required. And the other thing, and again, I'm speaking here as a Quebecer. Once you get used to something, once you get used to recycling, it just becomes second nature. Once you get used to free education, you get used to it. Why do you think the French go out in the streets every time they would threaten anything? Because they've never paid for education. Why should they start now? That's again why attitudes are so important. And it's my slippery slope thing. We got to be really careful about what we fight for. We may as well go for the whole thing. Incremental stuff is probably worse. All right. Thank you.